In the middle of a muddy flash flood swallowing the Makari Valley, a young ranger clung to a slick boulder, terrified as a big male lion raced along the high bank like a predator waiting for her to slip. She was certain she was about to die under his fangs, until she realized every place he stopped marked shallower water, leading her toward a hidden ledge and a cub trapped beneath a fresh rockfall. That was the first day Elena understood there is another language between people and wild creatures, the shared terror of losing a child and the fierce desire to keep one small life in this world. Rafiki felt the change long before the sky darkened. The old lion lay on a flat rock above the Makari riverbed, eyes half closed, mane lifting gently in the hot wind. To anyone watching from far away, he looked like a creature at ease, a king resting after a hunt. But under his ribs, his chest rose a little faster than usual. The air tasted wrong. He drew in another breath, deep and slow. Beneath the dusty scent of dry grass and antelope trails, there was something sharp and metallic, like stones struck together. In the distance, thunder rolled over the hills, too far away to see the storm, close enough for the ground to answer with a faint tremor. Behind him, a small set of paws scrambled over the rock. Lumo, his son, clambered up and flopped down against his flank with the careless weight of youth. The cub's fur was still soft and pale, his spots not yet faded. He batted at Rafiki's tail tuft, then froze when his father's muscles tightened. Rafiki stood, the great shoulders shifting under his coat. He looked down toward the riverbed. For months, the Makari had been little more than a memory, a ribbon of cracked mud, scattered pools no deeper than a lion's paw. Herds had pushed closer and closer to this place, wearing their fear into the dust with every step. Water was life here, and life had been running out. Now the river smelled like it was waking up too fast. On the far side of the valley, an open-topped vehicle crawled along a dirt track. The engine murmured, the metal roof rattled over the ruts. Elena Carter sat in the back, elbows braced on the rail, binoculars pressed to her eyes. It was her first week in Makari, her first season in a land that did not know the word predictable. She had learned the names of birds and grasses, memorized maps and safety protocols, repeated the phrase, flash flood, until it no longer sounded real. Through the glass, she found Rafiki on his rock, mane burned gold by the lowering sun. Jonas's voice crackled over the radio at her hip, low and firm, reminding her why the lion had a name on their charts. "Rafiki's trouble," he said. "Never forget that, Carter. He's a storm on four legs." Rafiki lifted his head, eyes turning toward the hills. Lightning flickered too far away for the tourists to notice, too close for him to ignore. He nudged Lumo with his muzzle, a quiet, urgent gesture. The cub whined, reluctant to leave his game, but followed as his father stepped off the rock. The wind shifted, carrying the first faint roar of distant water, a sound no dry season should ever make. Morning came with a pale, honest light that made danger seem far away. Elena parked the patrol truck under a lone acacia tree, the metal hood ticking as it cooled. The sky above the Makari Valley was a clear, washed-out blue, the kind that made yesterday's distant thunder feel like a story someone else had told. She checked her radio, her water, the worn field notebook Jonas had pressed into her hand her first day. On the inside cover, he had written 3 words in blunt, blocky letters: "Respect the river." It made her smile. She slipped the notebook into her pack and stepped down onto the dry earth. To the south, the riverbed lay open and empty, a long scar of pale stone and cracked mud. It didn't look like a place that could turn deadly in minutes. It just looked tired. Elena walked along the Heiser bank at first, boots crunching on grit, eyes scanning for tracks. She found the faint prints of impala, the rounded marks of a hyena, then something larger. A broad, deep pad with claws sheathed, pressed into a patch of dried silt. She knelt, tracing the edges with her fingertip. "Rafiki," she murmured. The size, the depth, the stride, they matched the file photos and charted territories she had studied at night. Next to the big print, half overlapping, was a smaller pad, still clumsy at the edges. Lumo. Father and son walking side by side. The radio crackled at her hip, pulling her back. Jonas's voice came through, rough with morning fatigue. "Carter, storm reports from the hills again. Keep your eyes open. Those flash floods don't care what the sky looks like where you stand." She glanced up. Over her, the air was still and bright. Far away, on the horizon, a faint gray smear hovered above the ridge, easy to ignore at this distance. "Copy that," she said. "I'm staying close to the bank." There was a pause, then a soft sigh. "Close is fine. Low is not. You know the drill." When the radio went quiet, the valley felt bigger. Elena looked back at the tracks, at the story pressed into the earth, a cautious old lion and his curious child. The idea of following them tugged at her. If she could map Rafiki's route to the river, if she could understand how he used this land, it would be more than notes in a book. It would be a way into his world. A few steps down from the bank, the ground sloped gently toward the riverbed, where the mud was firmer and the tracks clearer. She hesitated only a moment, then started down, eyes on the path left by the lion and his small shadow, unaware that the same river they had walked beside was already beginning to change somewhere out of sight. By midday, the light over Makari had turned flat and harsh, as if the sky were holding its breath. Rafiki moved. Slowly, along the ridge, Lumo trotting at his heels, the rest of the pride spread out behind them. The air was heavier now, carrying a low growl that did not belong to any animal. It came from the hills, from somewhere his eyes could not reach. He stopped often to listen. Each time the sound was closer. Far to the north, clouds had gathered into a dark wall that swallowed the peaks. The storm there was a distant thing, hidden behind miles of dry land, but its work was already on the move. Rafiki could feel it under his paws, a faint, steady thrum, like the heartbeat of something waking. He led the pride toward higher ground, away from the open riverbed. The lionesses followed without question. They knew his moods, the way his tail flicked when he was uneasy, the way his ears tipped when he caught a sound they could not yet hear. Only Lumo lagged, distracted by every scent and stone, stopping to pounce on beetles and chase dust. As they passed above a narrow bend in the Makari, Rafiki glanced down. The bed was still mostly dry, littered with broken branches and old bones. But in the deepest channel, a thin strip of water moved where there had been none, the day before. It was not much, just a dark line. But it ran fast. He rumbled low in his chest, a warning to himself as much as to his son. The thin line would grow. A sharp crack split the air behind him. For an instant he thought it was lightning, but there was no flash. The ground under his back paws dropped, then shuddered. A section of the rocky slope gave way with a grinding roar, stones sliding, then tumbling down toward the riverbed in a dirty, rattling wave. Lumo, who had been exploring a little below the others, scrambled to climb back up. The earth crumbled under his claws. Rafiki spun, lunged toward him, but the sliding rock moved faster than any leap. In seconds, the cub disappeared into a fresh wound in the hillside, swallowed between jagged stones. A high, muffled cry rose from the new pile of rock. Rafiki skidded to the edge, sending more gravel rushing down. He could see only a small patch of Lumo's fur, a paw flailing weakly. Then the first rush of brown water pouring through the gaps. The thin, dark line in the channel had already swelled into a rushing tongue that licked higher with every breath. He tried to force his weight against the biggest stones, pushing, clawing, teeth scraping on unyielding rock. The river answered with a louder roar, rising around his legs. The Makari, empty and harmless for so long, was filling itself all at once, and his son was trapped at its lowest point. Rafiki threw back his head and roared, the sound torn between rage and fear, his voice swallowed almost at once by the growing thunder of the angry river. Elena first noticed the change in sound before she saw the water. It was a low murmur at the edge of hearing, like distant traffic in a city she had left far behind. She was kneeling in the riverbed, tracing the outline of a lion's print with her thumb, when the murmur deepened into a steady rush. She straightened slowly. The air felt different on her skin, cooler and restless. Somewhere up the valley, a bird gave a sharp alarm call and went silent. A thin breeze slipped along the dry channel, carrying with it the faint smell of wet stone. Then she heard it clearly, a broad, rolling roar, not from any throat she knew. She turned upstream. The Makari was coming back to life. At first, it was just a brown tongue of water sliding around a bend, no higher than her ankles, moving faster than her mind wanted to accept. In seconds, it thickened, picked up branches and clumps of brush, and began to climb its own banks. The dry stones at her feet darkened one by one, like a stain spreading across a tablecloth. "Too fast," she whispered. She spun toward the higher bank she had come down from and started to run. The mud sucked at her boots, each step slower than the last. Behind her, the water lunged forward with a sudden, hungry surge. A floating log slammed into her legs, knocking her off balance. She caught herself with one hand on a smooth rock, but her feet slid out from under her. Cold, gritty water wrapped around her waist, then her chest, dragging at her pack. She grabbed for the nearest jut of stone and held on, breath torn short. The river pulled, trying to peel her fingers away, trying to take her downstream into the narrowing, twisting gut of the valley. The bank above her was now a slick wall of mud and roots. There was no way up. A roar cut through the storm of sound, sharp and alive. Elena's head snapped toward it. On the opposite side of the river, on a strip of higher ground, stood Rafiki. His mane was plastered to his neck, his sides heaving, eyes burning gold in the dim light. He paced along the edge, muscles bunched, tail lashing. Every few steps he threw his head back and roared again, the sound aimed straight at her. For one long frozen moment, clinging to the rock while the flood clawed at her legs, Elena met his gaze and saw only one thing, a powerful, desperate predator following her every move. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was about to die between the river that wanted to swallow her and the lion that seemed ready to finish what the water began. The lion did not stay in one place. As Elena clung to the rock, Rafiki surged into motion, running along the strip of higher ground, his paws thudding against wet earth in rhythm with the flood's roar. He kept his eyes on her, never on the drifting debris or the darkening sky. Each time the river shoved her a little, he moved with her, as if tethered to her by some invisible line. At first, she thought he was simply pacing, maddened by the rising water. But then she noticed where he stopped. He would dash ahead of her, climb a little higher here on the bank, then slide back down until his paws almost met the edge of the flood. There he would plant himself, legs wide, claws dug into the soil. Water lapped at his toes, but it did not swallow them. The river was shallower there, skimming over a buried shelf of rock. Elena's fingers were going numb. The rock she gripped was slick now, the surface worn smooth by centuries of smaller floods. The current pressed at her hips like a living thing. Downstream, the river narrowed and twisted, white foam curling where the water slammed into hidden boulders. If she let go, it would carry her straight into that. Rafiki leaped again, this time closer to her. He roared, not once but in a series of short, harsh bursts, then stepped down onto another unseen ledge. The water reached his knees, swirled, and slid past. He looked enormous and terribly vulnerable, all at once. A great body standing in a force that could easily take him if he misjudged. She realized with a jolt that he was testing the ground before her. Elena's heart hammered so hard she could hear it in her ears. Every sensible part of her training screamed that closing the distance to a lion was lunacy. Yet another part, older and quieter, whispered that the river cared nothing for rules printed in manuals. The river would strip her from this rock sooner or later. The lion, at least for this moment, seemed less intent on killing her than on drawing her along a line only he could see. Her boot slipped a fraction. The water seized that chance, yanking her sideways. Her grip tore free. For a breathless instant she floated, weightless in muddy chaos. Then her shoulder slammed against another stone. When she surfaced, coughing, Rafiki was already ahead of her again, planted on the next shallow point, staring straight into her eyes. Between one panicked breath and the next, Elena made her decision. She fixed her gaze on the spots where he chose to stand and began to fight her way toward them, step by blind, trusting step, as if the great lion were a living map laid over the furious river. Step by step, the distance between Elena and the lion shrank. The water still pressed at her legs, cold and insistent, but it no longer clawed with the same wild force. The hidden rock shelves Rafiki chose held firm under her boots. Twice she slipped and went under, and twice she surfaced to find him already repositioned, a fixed point in the chaos. At last, the river swung wide around a broken bend where the bank had collapsed into a jagged mound of stone and earth. Here, the current slowed just enough to lose its teeth. Elena staggered onto a sloping ledge slick with mud and dropped to her knees, chest heaving. The world shrank to the sound of her own breathing and the heavy rush of water sliding past below. When she lifted her head, Rafiki was only a few strides away. He stood on a narrow shelf just above her, his flanks splattered with mud, mane dark and sodden. Up close, he seemed even larger, every line of muscle carved against the dim sky. His jaws were parted, sides heaving, but he made no move to lunge. His eyes were not fixed on her throat. They were restless, flicking from her face to the rock at his feet, then down toward the river's edge. He turned away from her with a rough growl, stepped higher, and looked straight down over the lip of the broken bank. Then he looked back at her, ears flat, lips pulled away from his teeth in a soundless snarl of frustration. His tail lashed once hard, as if scolding the earth itself. Elena frowned, confusion cutting through her fear. Carefully, keeping her movements slow, she crawled closer to the edge of her own ledge and peered down where his gaze had gone. At first, she saw only the churn of muddy water and the tangle of freshly fallen rocks. Then, beneath the surface, something pale flickered. A small shape wedged in a narrow pocket between stones, fur flattened by the current. A paw, no bigger than her hand, scraped weakly at the air before disappearing again under a sheet of brown foam. A thin, strangled sound rose up through the roar of the river. It was high and raw, half choked by water, the desperate cry of something young and afraid. Lumo! In that instant, the pieces fell into place. The pacing, the testing of the ground, the way Rafiki had driven himself along the bank in perfect time with her struggle. He had not been hunting her. He had been dragging her step by step to the only place where a pair of human hands might reach the small life trapped beneath the fallen stone. For a moment, Elena could only stare, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes had shown her. The cub's paw surfaced again, weaker now, claws scraping against stone before slipping back under the brown water. Above her, Rafiki let out a long, broken roar that tore at the air, his voice raw from use. "I know," she breathed, though he could not understand the words. "I see him." Her hands moved before her fear could argue. She shrugged off her pack with clumsy fingers and dragged it closer, yanking open the top. The small folding shovel Jonas had insisted she carry clinked against a length of coiled rope and a metal bar used for prying open old fence posts. Tools meant for orderly work under a calm sky. Tools she would now use on a flooded hillside with a lion breathing down her neck. She slid on her belly to the very edge of the ledge, boots braced against a jut of rock. The current clawed at the lower half of her body, eager to pull her down to where Lumo lay trapped. Carefully, she eased the shovel into the narrow gap between two stones and leaned her weight on it. The metal groaned. The rock shifted a fraction, then settled back, as if mocking her effort. Rafiki's growl rolled over her shoulders. He stepped closer, paws gripping the crumbling edge just above her. She could feel his breath on the back of her jacket, hot and harsh. Every nerve in her body screamed at the nearness of him, at the knowledge that one bite could break her in an instant. But the sound in his throat was not the cold rumble of a hunt. It was the restless, desperate noise of a heart that could not reach its own child. A dark shape slid through the water below, coming fast with the current. For a heartbeat, Elena thought it was another log. Then she saw the ridged back, the blunt snout. A young crocodile, dazed by the flood, spun toward the trapped cub. Before she could react, Rafiki launched himself down the slope, landing with a splash that sent muddy water over her hands. He hit the reptile with his full weight, driving it sideways, claws raking along its flank, sending it tumbling back into the faster water. The river lunged at him in return, nearly sweeping his back legs out from under him. He scrambled, found purchase, and forced himself back up to the ledge. As he climbed, Elena lost her grip. Her body slid forward toward the gap and the drop beyond. A set of jaws closed on her shoulder. The world narrowed to the pressure of teeth through wet fabric, the sharp shock of pain that did not quite cross into tearing. Rafiki's bite lifted, not dragged. He braced his front paws and hauled her back onto the rock, then released her and stumbled away as if the contact had burned him. Gasping, Elena rolled onto her back, feeling the deep ache where his teeth had clamped down, grateful for the thick layers of jacket between skin and fang. There was no blood, only bruises to come. Lumo's cry came again, thinner now. There was no time to dwell on what had just happened between them. Elena grabbed the metal bar with both hands, wedged it where the shovel had failed, and pressed with everything she had left. Above her, Rafiki lowered his head and added his weight, shoulder leaning against stone. Between the push of human and lion, the trapped rock finally shifted, inch by stubborn inch, opening a narrow, precious path to life. The rock moved with a grinding sigh, just enough to loosen the choke of stones around the cub. Water rushed into the new gap, surging around Lumo's small body. For a heartbeat, Elena feared they had made it worse. Then the cub's head broke the surface, coughing and spitting, paws flailing for any solid hold. "Come on, little guy," she whispered, though the river stole most of her breath. Rafiki dropped lower, wedging his great body between the loosened stones and the water's pull. His shoulder took the brunt of the current, muscles shuddering with the strain. With one paw, he hooked Lumo's scruff, dragging him farther from the choking edge. The cub clawed weakly at his father's leg, more alive now than a moment before, but far from safe. Elena reached down, fingers numb, and caught the loose skin behind Lumo's neck, just as she'd been taught with wayward barn kittens as a girl. The weight was heavier, the stakes far crueler. She heaved, using every bit of strength left in her back and legs. For an instant, cub and woman and lion all hung on the same thin thread. Then Lumo slid free of the rocky pocket and bumped against her chest. She hugged him close for one stunned second, feeling his ribs hammer against her arm, his wet fur rough and cold. He smelled of mud and fear. and something wild that had nothing to do with her. "Go," she said, voice shaking. She pushed the cub toward higher ground. Rafiki was there in an instant, teeth closing around his son with a gentleness that did not match his size. He backed up the slope, water swirling around his haunches, until Lumo lay on a patch of solid earth above the floodline, sides heaving. For a long, suspended moment, Rafiki stood between his son and the human. His body blocked her path up, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the world around them fade. The river still roared, but its voice seemed distant. He could have closed the distance. He did not. Instead, he held her gaze a heartbeat longer, something like recognition flickering there, then turned away. Elena used the opening and scrambled higher, knees trembling, fingers bleeding from unseen cuts. By the time she reached the top of the broken bank and looked back, Rafiki and Lumo were already climbing toward the ridge, two tawny shapes against the gray sky. They did not look back again. Hours later, when the worst of the water had passed and the valley lay quiet under a dim, washed-out light, Jonas found her sitting on a rock above the scarred river. Her jacket was torn at the shoulder, dark with bruises. Her hair was matted with mud, but she was alive. "What on earth happened to you?" he asked, eyes wide. She glanced toward the hills where the lion had gone, then down at the river that had almost taken everything. "A lion showed me the way out," she said softly, "and I showed him the way to his child." Months passed. The Makari settled into a slower, gentler flow, as if nothing terrible had ever happened between its banks. One evening, near the end of the dry season, Elena walked the high path above the river at sunset. The air was still, the sky painted with soft colors older than any map. On a distant rise, a lion's silhouette appeared, mane lifted by the evening breeze. Beside him stood a younger shape, taller now, still lean with youth. They paused at the edge of the land where stone dropped toward the remembered flood path. For a brief, quiet moment, the younger lion, Lumo, turned his head and looked down toward her. The distance was too great to read his eyes, but she felt the weight of that simple, steady gaze. Then Rafiki moved on, and Lumo followed, disappearing into the tall grass. Elena stayed where she was, hands resting on the warm rail of the overlook, listening to the soft murmur of the tamed river below. In her mind, it still roared. In her chest, something gentler answered. She had come to Makari to protect wildlife, to stand between animals and danger. On that first terrible day alone, a lion had calmly stepped into that role for her. And somewhere out there, she knew, a young lion would grow up with a memory buried as deep as hers, the feel of strange hands in a storm lifting him out of the flood, while his father turned fear into a path back to safety. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.